and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's top 10 episodes of Star Trek Deep Space Nine. This video is a revamped, updated version / replacement for my top 10 Deep Space Nine episode video that I made 6 years ago. I just found the original video was dated and it was a poor quality as it was before I started making YouTube videos on a regular basis. Plus I found my choices are a bit dated as well as I changed my mind a little bit, so I decided to make this updated version where I count down my top 10 favorite episodes as well as my 5 least favorite episodes of Star Trek Deep Space Nine. So as I always do, I start off my video by naming my bottom 5 worst episodes of Deep Space Nine. So these are the episodes of this great show that I like the least. We'll start with my number 5, If Wishes Were Horses. While most people try to point to Move Along Home as an example of a horrible, ridiculous first season episode, I respectfully disagree, and I think that episode isn't that bad. Instead, I would point to If Wishes Were Horses, the episode that saw O'Brien being followed around by Rumpelstiltskin, and Sisko having, being buddy-buddy with a classic baseball player. And this was all explored by a flimsy and ridiculous plot about some strange alien beings who for some reason turned the crew's imagination into reality. This was a poorly conceived plot that was poorly executed, and unlike Move Along Home, it doesn't come across as fun, but just ridiculous. Number 4 on my list is Badda-Bing, Badda-bang. So I haven't been shy about pointing out on my channel how much I hate the character of Vic Fontaine, who by far is my least favorite character in the entire Star Trek universe, and I felt his introduction to the show in Season 6 marred the last 2 seasons of the show that were otherwise fantastic, and this episode was the one that focused on him the most, and I absolutely couldn't stand it as I found it just a cheap imitation ripoff of Ocean's 11, and the excuse they gave to do this plot was paper thin, and the way it was executed was ridiculous, and this was definitely a low point for the entire series. Next on my worst list is number 3, One Little Ship. This seemed like an interesting idea of having a shrunken runabout fly around the Defiant and try to free it from the Dominion that had taken over, but the way it was executed was horrible, as the plot of this shrunken ship just played out as a lesser version of Honey, I Shrunk the Kids that resulted in a bunch of stupid small puns rather than an interesting plot, and the whole plot of there being like Alpha Quadrant bred Jim Hajar subverting, the Gamma Quadrant bred ones and acting like they're all superior, but they turn out to be, to just be dumb and make egregious mistakes, was a cartoon level of silly and ridiculous and just came off as really bad. Number 2 on my worst list is The Muse. This is one of the worst episodes in all of Star Trek, and this desperate move to make Jake relevant to the show, which just comes off as a laughably bad B-movie plot of an alien literally feeding off of Jake's creativity, comes off as just as horrible as a B-movie. And to make matters worse, the other storyline in this episode is a half-assed appearance by Luoxana Troi, where she has to marry Odo to get the father of her child to back off. I was never a fan of Luoxana Troi episodes in the first place, but this one was by far the worst of all of them, as it wasn't even fully developed and just came off as nonsense. And my number 1 worst episode of Star Trek Deep Space Nine is Prophet and Lace. I'll talk about episodes that are just poor imitation of movies. This was obviously meant to be DS9's version of Mrs. Doubtfire, and we're supposed to get a kick out of seeing Quark and Drag, but it just comes off as a ridiculously horrible attempt at comedy that just repeats every single Mrs. Doubtfire cliche that we've seen in dozen cross-dressing films, and to be perfectly honest, I've never been a fan of those films as they just repeat the same gags that were never funny to begin with. The irony is that this episode attempts to present a feminist message about Quark trying to acquire equal rights for Ferengi females, while at the same time bolstering every stereotype about women, such as them being overly emotional and not as strong strong as men in a lame attempt to make this episode funny, but it just comes off as incredibly lame, making this my least favorite episode of Star Trek Deep Space Nine, possibly my least favorite episode of the entire Star Trek franchise. So that's enough of the negativity. Let me now get it down to the best of Star Trek Deep Space Nine. But before I get into my top 10, let me start off by naming a few honorable mentions that didn't quite make my list, starting with Things Past. This was an effectively dark episode where Sisko, Dak, and Garrick are trapped in Odo's memories as they are forced to relive the lives of 3 innocent Bajorans that Odo had executed, and this deals with his guilt and expresses the important issue of how Odo must have gotten his hands dirty during his time working for the Cardassians, and it does it in a very powerful way. Next honorable mention is the two-parter Homefront / Paradise Lost. This was a powerful two-parter that starts off as showing a changeling infiltration of Earth, which leads Sisko and Odo to investigate it, but turns out to be a story of a Starfleet admiral attempting to use this threat to gain power by stoking people's fears. And thus it turns into a powerful message about giving in to one's fears over terrorism, and how this actually allows the terrorists to win, as the changeling even admitted that the inner turmoil caused by the fear of a possible invasion was more effective and less costly than the actual invasion itself, making this a particularly noteworthy episode. Another honorable mention is the two-parter Past Tense. In this episode, Sisko and Bashir travel back to a time where the homeless are shuffled into sanctuary districts, which have the appearance of being for their benefit, but in actuality are ghettos to keep them out of sight. And although this episode features some of the worst time-traveling logic I've ever seen, that can be overlooked by the very powerful story of Sisko fighting for his right, even if it means his own death. This is arguably one of the best character stories for Sisko, as well as one of Avery Brooks' best performances. It also features a cast of really interesting and dynamic guest characters and a thrill ride of a story, making this one of DS9's best episodes. Next honorable mention is The Changing Face of Evil, a part of the ending story arc that closed out the show, which I absolutely loved and was a high point of the series and a great way to end it out. This episode in particular was one of the stronger entries, as it dealt with the consequences of the Breen joining the Dominion in their war against the Federation, as the crew had to deal with a Breen attack on Earth, and later when Sisko takes the Defiant to lead a fleet against Dominion forces, where they get their asses kicked. In fact, the Defiant gets destroyed. But after all this doom and gloom, the episode ends on a very exciting high note when Damar announces he will lead a Cardassian rebellion against the Dominion. And I remember my heart beating really fast, and it's really got my blood pumping. This whole episode was an amazing thrill ride. And my final honorable mention is Whispers. This second season episode has always been a favorite of mine, as it's a unique twist on the whole parallel universe alternate reality storyline, as when O'Brien returns to the station and finds everyone behaving strangely, you think he's in a parallel universe or something like that, but instead it turns out that this O'Brien is just a clone that it was meant to infiltrate the station, and it was done amazingly well, as we see things from this clone's perspective, as he actually thought he was the real O'Brien, and the episode did a great job of making the audience feel the same, making the ending where the clone died expressing his love for Keiko quite touching and powerful. Now, getting into my top 10, starting with my number 10, Far Beyond the Stars. Typically, I find episodes where a character experiences a vision set in the 20th century ridiculous, but this episode was anything but, as it was executed extremely well. First, in being an extremely effective character story for Sisko, as it explores his fatigue and doubts about being involved in the war, but through the lens of an African-American science fiction writer in the 50s who learns imagination is a very powerful thing while having to deal with racism that attempts to hold him back. This was a very well-told character story with some powerful messages about racism and the importance and power of storytelling, and how this can be an effective tool to maintain hope in dark times. Next, on to my number 9, which is What You Leave Behind. I absolutely love this episode. It was a great way to end this series in a typically dark DS9 fashion, as we see the Federation Klingon alliance finally achieve victory in the Dominion War, but that was accomplished in a typical dark fashion true to Deep Space Nine, and in fact true to the spirit of Star Trek, as it emphasizes the horror of war and presents war as something to be avoided at all costs rather than romanticizing the heroism of it. And the realism of them building up Damar as this great hero who will reform Cardassia, and then he just dies, leaving Garrick to just brutally murder Wayum. It was such a dark, complex story that makes it the hallmark of great storytelling that Deep Space Nine is known for, and plus it has a bittersweet way to say goodbye to all these characters as they all go their separate ways. And I would have loved to put this episode in my top 3 had it not been for the long, drawn-out singing hologram, thank you Vic Fontaine, sequence with this cheesy, melodramatic flashback sequences. I'm sorry, but that does bring the entire episode down a bit. But it's still a great episode. Moving on to my number 8 on my list, which is Improbable Cause and the Die is Cast. This is a great two-parter that takes most advantage of one of my favorite characters on Deep Space Nine, Garrick, as it deals with the mystery of his shop blowing up and how he manipulates the situation to get Odo's help. And this features some of the best Garrick lines in the entire series, such as him saying that, "Oh, I find truth to just be a lack of imagination," and his response to Bashir telling him the story of the boy who cried wolf, being that the real moral of the story is never to tell the same lie twice. And then it goes on to tell the very intense story of the Tal Shiar and the Obsidian Order teaming up to destroy the Founder's homeworld, which was really exciting, had a lot of ins and outs, with an amazing conclusion where it all turns out to be a trap set by Changeling infiltrators. Such an amazing storytelling, making this one of my most favorite episodes of Deep Space Nine. Number 7 on my list is Behind the Lines, an example of a great Dominion takeover the station's story arc, and one of the most exciting. It explores Sisko's bittersweet appointment of given a desk job, but more importantly, Kira's attempts to mount a resistance to the Dominion occupation of the station, and how Odo's involvement in that gets complicated when the female changeling visits the station, which leads to one of the most shocking, powerful endings where Odo ends up getting so distracted by learning of his heritage, he fails to play his part in a sabotage mission that leads to its failure and Rom's capture and eventual execution. This was a highly engaging character story that really raised the stakes of the station takeover arc in a powerful way by taking risks and having one of the main characters, Odo, betray one of his friends. A prime example of why Deep Space Nine is such an awesome show, because it was willing to take risks most other shows weren't. Next is my number 6, which is The Visitor. This was a very emotionally powerful episode that explores the deep relationship between Captain Sisko and his son in a unique way by using the fascinating method of time travel. It's told in a unique manner by seeing the story through the eyes of Jake as an old man in an alternate future, and it's totally fascinating to see him recount the events of losing his father and what effect this had on history, but we see it through his eyes, as this helps the viewer see these wide sweeping sci-fi themes through the lens of a son who misses his father, and it was extremely effective that way in a very powerful tearjerker episode. It's simply a masterpiece. My number 5 is Sacrifice of Angels. This exciting and suspenseful thrill ride concludes the Dominion takeover of the station's story arc in the most exciting way, as the Defiant leads a massive space battle whose purpose is to make it to Deep Space Nine before the Cardassians bring down the minefield on the wormhole to allow Dominion reinforcements from the Gamma Quadrant to come swarming in, while Kira and her friends try to find a way to prevent them from doing so from the inside, but run into problems when they are found out and arrested. On top of all these exciting espionage and war stories, we get a lot of powerful personal stories, such as Odo regretting his decision to betray the ones he loved and abandoning his people in order to make things right with Kira, and Gul Dukat's love for his daughter, who does betray him in order to do the right thing by helping Kira, which leads Damar to kill her for this action, which drives Dukat insane, which was an absolutely chilling performance by Mark Alamo. And yes, I even love the fact that Sisko got the unexpected help from the wormhole aliens by making the Dominion reinforcements disappear. I found that it was a really exciting, totally consistent with the relationship that the show has shown that he has with them. And overall, this was an absolute brilliant way to conclude the station takeover arc, a story arc that in itself was amazing as it takes huge risks that pay off in spades. Moving on to my number 4, The Quickening. This is another great example of Deep Space Nine taking risks and being unpredictable, as it tells the story of Dr. Bashir encountering a planet plagued by genetically engineered disease, which he arrogantly believes he can cure in a few weeks, and it has the very powerful ending of him actually failing. He does, however, succeed in coming up with a vaccine for pregnant women that will make their children immune to the disease, but fails in coming up with a cure for those already infected, which was such a powerful, bittersweet ending. And this was a fantastic character story for Bashir, as we are with him in his emotional journey, as he has to learn to overcome his arrogance and deal with defeat, while at the same time maintain the spirit of never giving up. And to see this contrasted with the doctors of the planet, who have indeed given up and instead try to manage pain as best they can, which includes helping those who are terminally ill commit suicide, was very nicely handled. As was Bashir's relationship with his chief patient, whom they managed to care for each other. And it was so heartbreaking as he had to watch her die just as he saved her child's life. Another very powerful tear-jerking moment, which to me makes this episode stand out above the rest. Number 3 on my list is Tacking Into the Wind, another fine example from the Dominion War story arc that ended the series, which in itself was a risky move. This, in my opinion, was the best example of that arc and one of the best of the entire series, as it was equally emotional, powerful, and suspenseful, as it switches between 3 different storylines in what in modern times could be referred to as a Game of Thrones style of storytelling, as we see O'Brien and Bashir struggle to come up with a way to cure the disease Odo is infected with, which involves a plan to trick Section 31, and then we see Worf having to deal with Gowron threatening the entire Klingon fleet on a personal political vendetta, and we perfectly see the journey he goes through as he realizes that he won't stand for this anymore, and ends up in the most epic Klingon fight where we see Worf finally defeat Gowron in hand-to-hand combat. It was awesome. And third, and the most exciting storyline, we see Kira trying to help the Cardassian resistance, who is constantly challenged and tested by Damar's second in command, which accumulates in an awesome Mexican standoff where they're all holding phasers at each other's heads in a Tarantino-esque conclusion where Damar has to choose between which Cardassia to have, the one that he knows or the one that can be. And on top of that, we get a truly touching story of Kira and Odo's romance, as she has to deal with the fact that he's dying in a very powerful way. Number 2 on my list is In the Pale Moonlight. One of my all-time favorite episodes of all of Trek. This was an extremely risky and controversial episode that breaks all sorts of TV norms, as it sees Sisko take a journey to the dark side as he lies, extorts, and eventually is complicit in murder in order to accomplish the ultimate goal of bringing the Romulans to their side of the war in order to turn the tides of war. And it was absolutely perfect that his guide to this journey was Garrick, as this episode makes the best use of him, as it really illustrates just how devious and scrupulous he can be, as he concocts this whole plan to murder a high-ranking Romulan senator and blame the Dominion for it, and he plays Sisko to make it happen. And the scene where Sisko finds out what happens and beats the crap out of Garrick in response was amazing, as Garrick actually makes him realize that this was all necessary to save the entire Alpha Quadrant, and to see Sisko come face to face with this when he's recording his personal log, as he realizes that if he had to do it all over again, he would, was an amazing and powerful way to end the episode. And let's not forget the amazing "it's a fake" scene where Senator Vreenak realizes the Dominion plot Sisko was presenting to him was a lie attempting to deceive them into war. This was the most chilling moment in all of Star Trek history, as typically Trek and shows like this would never have the heroes fail in such an incredible way, and it was truly a historic moment in all of Trek, making this my second favorite episode of Deep Space Nine. And my number one favorite episode of Star Trek Deep Space Nine is Duet. This is also my all-time favorite episode of all of Star Trek. Duet is an awesome example of how thrilling, suspenseful, emotionally powerful, and thought-provoking a visual story can be by consisting almost entirely of just two people in a room talking. Good dialogue scenes are hard to find, and the ability to craft a story so powerful that covers such a large range of emotions is a rare and unique thing. And the acting in this episode was truly amazing, as Kira goes toe-to-toe with Goldar Hill, one of the most infamous war criminals of the occupation, who is not only not apologetic about the atrocities he committed, but actually proud of it. But with an amazing journey of twists and turns and emotional high points, we learn that Darhill isn't, in fact, Darhill, and is just an average Cardassian ashamed of the crimes his race has committed and attempts to give his life to force them to admit their guilt. This was such a powerful journey, as Kira is confronted with her hate of Cardassians, which at the beginning of the episode obviously extends to all Cardassians regardless, and she faces this head on and discovers there are actually honorable, heroic Cardassians, which make her question and rethink her racial prejudice, and to only have this honorable man be killed in a hate crime truly drives home the futility of prejudice, no matter how justified it may seem. When one of the most powerful pieces of fiction I've ever experienced, making this my number one favorite episode of Star Trek Deep Space Nine. So that's it for my top 10 episodes of Star Trek Deep Space Nine. You can check out my updated version of my Star Trek, the original series, top 10 episodes. And next week I will be updating my top 10 Voyager episodes as well. However, for my Next Generation Enterprise episode top 10s, I will not be updating those, but you can find the originals on my channel, as well as many more Star Trek videos to come, and many more other videos on shows like Game of Thrones, Black Sails, The Expanse, The 100, and more, so be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that, and thanks a lot for watching.